Okay, so welcome to the 8th Evolving Man podcast. Today I'm very excited to be speaking to Ipswa, and I'm not sure if I can pronounce his name fully, but he will in a moment. Ipswa will describe and kind of go into a bit more detail about his background. It's really lovely to have you here, so thank you for coming, Ipswa. So the plan for this the talk today is we're just going to go in and speak a little bit about some of the kind of the racial divide, some of the tension which is going on from a more First Nation perspective. And Ipswa is based over in Canada, and so I just wanted to hear an elder's version. So welcome, Ipswa. Lovely to have you here.
So tense Ipswa Mescacakanis Douglas CMA Gideasa as the name of Kigada Isma. So good morning, relatives. I just like to always speak in my grandmother's tongue. And first I'd like to acknowledge all of our relatives out there in the various lands and territories that you're in. Particularly today, I'm here in Snuneymuxw territory where I preside about a quarter of the year. And in doing this, it reminds me of our connection to the people, the culture, and our place in history. And the oral culture, where I come from, is one of our most coveted and sacred ways of not only telling story, but reminding us of our history and how we're related and connected. So I'm a cultural knowledge holder. I've been the tribal admin, and I've worked a lot globally in different organizations and places. But my day-to-day role, I just see myself as a great-grandfather. And part of that role is helping to raise the village, in this case, a global village. I spend a lot of time in my tribal canoes and a lot of time working with young people and intercultural groups to remind us of some of the things that did work and have continued to work for us. So I'm really grateful today to be here to share with you. And please do feel free to reach out to me over time. I'm a little slow to my email and phone, but I do get back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ipswa. So what I'll do is I'll put his email details and how you can contact Ipswa if you want to reach out in the description below. So, so thank you for agreeing to be with us. So we were discussing before I press record about kind of the news sources. So you were just saying you might want to record this. So if you want to just go back to that.
So part of my curiosity, and I'm very blessed to have relatives most of the way around the world. So there's questions, that come up about, how are we managing COVID? Why are we seeing so much racial violence and conflict? How and why, or what can we do to change our society and our culture from something that we know wasn't working to something that can? And so the first question I'm always curious about is what is reaching various communities and regions as far as media. What I was sharing is basically in this side of the hemisphere, we're owned really by two large media franchises, and they're relatively, actually, if you trace it back, one larger source. So most of what you see in mainstream media is controlled, even though they would like to say they have journalistic integrity. You're seeing sound bites that are not necessarily well represented. And then you see the other end of the extreme, which is the people that are so fed up with it that you get these individual bloggers, and some of which have some good merit to their thoughts, and some of which are pretty ludicrous. So I was just curious as to particularly what you've heard or what you've read on your part of the hemisphere, because it's hard to reply to these questions without having some knowledge of what is trickling out there.
Thank you. So in the UK, it's very similar. So we've got the mainstream media. I mean, for me, I've always been someone who's loved looking at the BBC and those sources. And over the past few years, I've started to question those things because it seems that, and even some of the independent newspapers here, what we've been receiving is very different to what seems to be going on. And So I've also been looking at independent news sources, or looking at some of these interviews with doctors or with scientists who aren't in the mainstream, and just getting a different perspective. But generally it's the same. You know, the BBC is very tied into the government, and whereas before it seemed very independent, over the last few years it doesn't seem that way. So we're very much the same. On my perspective, is that, yeah, we're seeing it's not independent anymore. So that's partly why I wanted to speak to you. Is what we're receiving is that, you know, certainly in this country, it's been illegal to protest up until 2-3 weeks ago for anything about COVID or lockdown. But as soon as this Black Lives Matter movement came in, and this seemed globally, that it's okay suddenly from one day to the next, it's okay to protest. And it just seemed kind of quite bizarre. And all of these companies supporting it, these big companies. So yeah, I guess that's from our perspective, is that, you know, it's quite confusing times. What is right? And what I've been doing is just coming back into my heart, and what feels right here, what feels right here. But I'd love to hear your perspective on what you see unfolding, especially with this racial divide, and yeah, what we can do to move forward. That's what I'm interested in.
Yeah, so, you know, I'm not an expert. You know, I've spent most of my life looking at different forms of colonization, different forms of oppression, different ways that our society works, doesn't work. And as an Indigenous scholar, what I know to be true is that as human beings, we don't deal well with change, and especially in this era, because the society and the culture around us has grown us to be codependent on a lot of things, and a lot of the predictability and what we perceive as comfort or safety. And so some of the things that COVID have offered us as lessons come out again in this racial divide, which really tells us, you know, this is our report card. You know, how well are we doing as a people or culture? So it's very interesting to look that many of our First Nation communities, particularly here in Canada, I don't recognize the Crown. No disrespect to Britain or France. There was a lot of amazement in the media about that First Nations actually were very quick and rapid to respond, and didn't seem to be as distressed in the moment beyond some of the financial and emotional stuff, which is understandable. You know, people were expecting, you know, us to be, you know, more challenged, and we had to remind the media, you know, we live in crisis almost every day. Crisis is a constant thing in our management of our tribal administrations, because that's how we've been set up to fail in society, right? Now we look at, you know, Black Lives Matter or men of color, or, you know, or people of color, and again, this is not a new issue. You know, this has been a story that's been told for the last 3-4 generations. But why does it come to the front of the foreground of the media? I think there's a number of factors. So one, people have had a time to pause. So one of the things COVID has given us an opportunity is to pause, consider, re-examine some of the life, what works, what doesn't work. And so I think the response is a bit more prolific than we've seen in the past, only simply because you know, there has been that pause. The other one is that I think a lot of the anxiety, the tension, the distress people are carrying, that they have to have somewhere to put it. So again, in traditional ceremony, in traditional life, we're aware of these tensions and anxieties that build up, and we have ways to deal with that, right? We offer, you know, alternative activities. We offer ceremony, talking search. We have ways, and we know this because we use these technologies in a lot of our different men's organizations. We use this in lots of other places. But when we've been isolated like this and struggling with all sorts of different methods of change, we've seen this, you know, time and time again, you know, that somehow there needs to be, you know, a revolt or revolution, or hopefully an evolution. And so Black Lives becomes a convenient train to hop on. right? So this issue hot sparks, and as you said, because I'm not surprised. I know there's parts of the world where there has been a sort of prohibition around, not criticizing the government or talking about the issue at hand, and so it becomes very easy to skip, phenomenologically, psychosociologically to another issue, and to prevent that. And we see that in our family, right? Dad or mom comes home from a stressful day at the office, the factory, and explodes about the dishes. It's really not about the dishes. So my invitation, I think, in some of the intercultural stuff is, it's great that we look at what is or isn't working for populations of the world. The reality is most of us that live here in what would be First Nation states, live in what we call a fourth world. And it's beyond a third world poverty, because we live with abundance all around us, and yet we don't often have access to it. So it's a very different phenomenology, and I can't speak for all Black people, but I can speak for many that I have working relationship with, where, like I said, some certainly have access to wealth, because it's being passed on intergenerationally, and many don't. The divide of have and have not within the cultural groups is often quite clear. And so it's very difficult to live in a society and culture that talk about the struggles they have with what we call golden problems, because they can't get their Amazon box, or they can't get their twiddly-digs and their woodly-woos, when most of us struggle just to figure out how we're going to feed the community or the family this week. And COVID certainly brought that to the foreground. So when I look at the media, when I look at the impact of this conversation, is in some ways, for those of you that have looked at different multicultural tools, it's almost another form of white privilege. It's easy for a moment, it'll become the cause. Today it's Black Lives, tomorrow it'll be Save the Whales. And so I sometimes wonder, and this is just me, no disrespect, because I know many of you are compassionate, open-hearted people who want to make difference. But just as quickly it disappears when the next leading headline runs in the news, and we get outraged about whatever that's about. And I go, did it really have impact? Did local change happen, or was there good dialogue or discourse of how do we undo some of the systemic damage that we've inherited? I don't believe anybody wakes up, consciously hating or consciously wanting to target other groups. It's a learned behavior, and it's a systemic behavior, not only in our institutions, in our education systems, in our governments, and many of them are unconscious. And so Francis Fanon, who is a great academic around colonization, and why I say colonization is that many of those tools also lead into racial conflicts. And he said the colonizers become, onto the new people, they become colonized, and they become the next colonizers. And so we were in this vicious cycle of constantly trying to get out of the box of something we've all inherited. And for me, COVID gave us an opportunity to look at that, and just look at, how are our systems working and not working? What do we really need in life? And are those basic needs being met? What would life look like? If we weren't doing the factory worker job stuff, if we weren't in school every day. And I think some have found answers in that, and I think some have struggled to adapt in the reality of those changes, and others have simply gone back to sleep. It was easier to just sort of let it go by, anesthetize, and continue on. And so I'm hoping, and my guess is many of you listening to this podcast are the ones that have noticed something different in your lives and looking to evolve or change. And so we just go back to, what can happen, needs to happen in your backyard, needs to happen in your local area. The likelihood of changing something across the globe is going to take a massive change, but what happens regionally can matter.
Thank you, Ipswa. So I'm hearing this idea of changing kind of locally. What kind of things, can we do to break this cycle? Certainly it sounds like, yes, it will take a lot of effort on a global level, but what can we do individually?
So, part of what I encourage people is, start getting in relationship with things that are different than you. Now that may be you a little bit challenging. You say, all my neighbors are the same. And I go, so right there, we're not recognizing diversity. We make assumptions that the neighbor must be just exactly like us because they might look like us or sound like us. And then two, reach out. The great thing about this global internet web of life we have is that there are many amazing people we can connect to that can open our eyes to some of the challenges we may be blind to. Two, be aware of how the power and privileges we do have locally. So when we often say, if you see something, say something. Be the one to be that ally to call something out in the room and just say, hey, maybe there's something else going on here that we need to look at. And one of the things we do often as Indigenous people is we just sometimes just take a pause and allow for space. Right? Allow for the other voices and to look at, even in our own container, what voices are not being heard in the circle. When we pass the talking stick, part of that encourages that notion, right? Because we're only strong if our circle is strong. We're only strong if all of our relatives or neighbors are doing well. So look at your ecology. Is your environment well? Is your land well? Are your people well? Who are the least members in your society, and are they getting the best care and concern that can be given to them? So here, we have a lot of street and homeless people. Are they getting the best food, or are they getting the leftovers of scraps? So what does that say then about our values, our principles? What does it take to have a conversation, to listen a little more and speak a little less? And for me, the other big thing is to also look at, what are we teaching? What are we passing on, to the next generation as far as being related, being connected? So those are some just starting things. And then, like I said, if you want to get more involved in intercultural and interracial stuff, then join or find some local organizations that are doing that work, that are really invested and know what's going on. And I can't say this unkindly, and I don't mean to target this, but please don't join one of the big white box, we're saving the world type organizations, because most of them are just as shadowy and just as privileged. But look at, where are your minority groups leading minority actions? Where are your minority representatives, speaking about minority issues? And some of that can be as simple as the environment. It can be about housing. It can be about food. It can be about job equity. It can be about all those things, and find out what those issues are and become aware of them. And if you're already aware, then help others become aware. And if you're helping that and you're already doing that, then help, organize and empower those other groups to have a larger platform. So those are just some starters. We could spend hours on this topic.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll come back to that in a bit. One thing I'd just like to come back to, Ipswa, is you just mentioned about talking stick. So for those people who don't know what that principle is, can you just describe a little bit from your tradition what that means and how we could bring that into society?
So there's different ways of doing this. And the most mechanical we've seen in I'm going to kind of lightly use it in New Age is a physical stick is passed around in a circle. So the concept is deeper than that. It's when we sit in council, when we sit together, all the voices are equal. We sit in a circle, even though we may have different roles, different responsibilities, different obligations in our society or our structure. When we sit together, it means that all voices need to be heard. And, we often work from what we call a consensus governance model. And some of you may or may not experience it. And some might think that this might take, a lot more time than, say, Robert's rules or whatever. But my experience has been that actually over time, if you're consistent, it's very effective. So the idea is normally as you pass a stick around, or it sits in the middle in what we call a kitch, which is like a holder of it. And as people feel called in spirit to talk from the place of their heart, And this is important, that they're talking from a place of heart, that they're not here to sell or to manipulate the circle or to proselytize, but they're speaking to what they sense or what they know to be true to their lives that's relevant to what's being shared in the container. And this is how collective wisdom comes out, and it's also how we create our oral culture. So the reason I say, well, some say, oh, we've lost oral culture in the UK, or we've lost it, and I go, no, you haven't. What happens is that you've stopped.
Yeah.
You stopped making space for your elders to tell traditional stories. We've stopped making space, you know, or seeking out those that do carry those understandings. You know, we paused on some of the ways we used to connect on the land. So part of the idea of oral culture is taking back our means of production, taking back our means of education, right? Taking back our means of self-identity and culture. And so when we open a circle and we allow for all of those voices to be heard, and we allow for space, we're creating diversity. We're creating connection. We're reducing racial conflict, because the divide of us and them disappears in a circle. Disappears when, you know, we take the fences down between the yards and realize that we share the common lands. So there's a depth of it beyond just, oh, this is a quick mechanism to share or get some people talking, but it's rather a way of sharing deeply and from a place of heart, and a collective way of creating collective knowledge, collective understanding, collective way of knowing what's going on in each and every member, and then making good decisions, or at least, you know, better decisions for the good of that container. So it's you know, think about like TED Talks or some of the better YouTube live in person, except that every member is a TED Talk. Every member has, you know, a collective piece to the story that we share, and a collective understanding of what might be going on around us on the land. Oh.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I've heard of, I can't remember the exact words. I know the way of counsel, but one of my wife's teachers has mentioned of there being someone in each direction holding the space, north, east, south, and west, and then the non-cardinals, and they hold that energy. And I've heard that that's very powerful. I can't remember the name for it. So thank you. So I have a few questions, and you know, the first one really was just to do with you know, Black Lives Matter, and thank you for answering that. I guess, I think, you know, you've started to answer this, but I'm just seeing this real disconnect from Mother Earth. And I feel the First Nations, I feel the indigenous cultures have that greater connection. And I'm just wondering, I'm seeing from, you know, say from the UK, we're really disconnected. And that, for me, the COVID, the lockdowns really shown a lot of us that disconnection, you know, by, you know, the canals in Venice clearing up, you know, the pollution going down. So moving forward, how do you feel that we can kind of connect again with Mother Earth?
So I'm really glad that you asked that, because like I said, I truly believe that one of the greatest gifts, even in this tragedy that we faced and this global struggle that we faced, is hopefully a bit of a reset of reality. And again, I say this with loving kindness. You know, there has been dialogue going on for as long as I can remember about environment, climate change, and the impact we're having on the earth. And I think that the fear message that is being used, although sometimes necessary and alarming to wake people up, doesn't encourage them to grow or change their methods, and more importantly, doesn't teach them how to show up differently In fact, what I experience for the most part is that it freezes them. So there's that sort of flight, freeze. The one that we miss in the model is tend and befriend.
Yeah.
Right. And so when we talk about the environment, we talk often about the earth in several different ways. And one of us is what I call the fragile earth. And the reality is, let's be really clean in our, and I hate, English is my fifth language. I know I sound really good here on recording, because I speak a lot as an oral speaker, but in my head, I'm always translating. So I'm often aware of what I lack in the nuance of certain parts of the language, and other ones where I go, do they really mean what they just said they meant to say? And so this idea of this fragile earth of the globe and the earth is just going to die. No, the earth isn't going to die. We are. Let's be really clear. The earth has gone through terrible and tumultuous things more than we've ever, seen or done by factories. And that doesn't mean that I don't want to see the factories stop. But I think we need to be really clear in the messaging and what we're communicating. So COVID, really has shown us, look at what happened when we paused for a month on the earth in producing all this stuff. Look how fast and resilient she responded. Yeah. So we had the largest herring return in the Pacific Northwest than I have seen in our lifetime. Wow. Because of just a simple slowdown in the traffic for a month allowed more herring to migrate and more of the road to brine on the branches and to reproduce from simply slowing the shipping traffic down for a month. Right? We've seen, changes, and the reality is the earth has been changing and continues to change and evolve for millions of years. The only difference is that the change has generally been slower and less accelerated than we've seen in recent era. And the reality is we've been coming out of the great deep freeze for a long time. So we've known this in the north for a very long time. When I remember as a young man seeing and walking on the ice floes, and what I saw when I was in my 20s, 40s, 60s, was radically different. Now, some of that's certainly been accelerated by industrial stuff. But going to that deeper question, I don't think that, many equate, our connection in some sort of, beyond them spiritual connection. And I simply know that's not true. I know many Irish farmers and growers that have as much connection to the land as we do. I know many of them in northern Scotland that have great connection to the land. I know places all over the world where we have it. And it's a simple thing. Our subsistence, our connection to it is because we subsist off the land, right? Therefore, we have relationship, right? It's not I walk my dog and I go out and enjoy the park on Sunday and I really like nature. And it's great that we do that. But what are we doing to create biodiversity in our backyard? Are we planting pretty flowers and green grass because we want to be like the Joneses? Or are we planting things that, on the tiniest little microscopic and organistic little twiddlers and wigglers, crawlers and creepers are going to harvest on? And we know this because, what I'm amazed is, I walk in certain parts of the UK, you can see where people are green belting. And creating biodiversity. You can see where there's intention. You look around and you see the remnants of the victory gardens. Now, of course, COVID reactivated that for some. Some of them started growing victory gardens again. Yeah. So really looking at our codependency on industry to produce everything for us. Looking at our codependency and the downside of having, job-specific training that kind of consumes the majority of our life hours. It's very hard to ask, and I certainly wouldn't, a single parent who already works 40 or 60 hours a week, to suddenly give up, what little time they have. But how do we restructure some of that time? How do we restructure some of our downtime to being activities that are going to get us, not only, using the earth in a wise way, but realizing, what we do in our backyard really does have impact globally. When we till up or build, super complexes and knock over, wildlands or whatever, and we don't replace some of that with something that's going to help it, return or restore, that's a problem. You know, if we use things that are going to break down and take 60 or 100 years in the recycle, that's a problem. One of the most moving moments I remember with my great grandmother on our territory was when she showed us the spot where all the tins went. And this was in a time, you know, just to give context to the readers today that can't imagine, this was in a time where most of the stuff we used, if it was preserved, we used mason jars. And even that was a luxury in my area. Most of what we made, we handmade, we hand dried, we hand preserved, and was hung or collected up. And, you know, we had a very small pantry, probably a small bookshelf of preserves. But in that time, cans had started to become a way of commodities being shipped. And I looked in this pit that would have been about the size of a 5-ton truck, you know, in the hole, and could see already the accumulation of cans that in our culture we had nothing to do. And, you know, we didn't have a dump. So people think putting things in the rubbish, you know, is a way. So where's a way? No, it's just being sent and collected somewhere else and condensed. But it really hit me, and I was quite young, but it landed in me in my psyche in a way of, wow. So every time I open a can of Coke or a bottle of whatever, you know, it has to go somewhere. And so we have to stop some of that and find, you know, more effective ways. And I know certainly you guys in the UK are way more ahead in green technologies and looking at these things. But I think in a local, personal level, what is your relationship to the land? You know, do you know your water? You know, this was a question the Hopi elder asked, and it's not just the water that runs by you. You know, are you connected to the sacred environment in some way? You know, do you know where your life-sustaining materials come from? Is it done in a good way? You know, is it sustainable? Is it going to be good enough for your great grandkids when they inherit what is left behind? And in the reality, I think if we look at the report card, is we've not been doing very well. So what would I like? I'd love to see us slow down. Love to see us consume a lot less. You know, find ways of growing locally. You know, find ways. One of the things we do here in our territory is we have a food recycle program. So the stores and the local shops and even our big boxes have agreed that it's just not effective, you know, to just stale date things and throw them out, because most of the stale dates still have plenty of life. And so about 80% of our food programs and our supports that go to poverty reduction, they've even moved their stale dates up. So, you know, stuff that's a few days, you know, that's not selling quickly, get into our food recycle programs. And what we're having the impact is we used to throw thousands of pounds of bread away. You know, we used to throw, you know, millions of metric tons of biofood, some of which would just go to farmers, you know, for hog feed and whatever. But a lot of it just went to the dump. You know, local and store owners, people have control of the volume. You know, look at how much is coming in and how much is getting wasted. So some of those simple little local things would have huge impact, not only in those that receive or can use that, whether that's, you know, at the farming level or those that are struggling with poverty. You know, there's nothing worse, and I've seen this time and again, and I've received it, you know, where you get rotten food, you know, because it was stale dated and sat too long. So now even just moving that up and making sure that it gets distributed cleanly has a huge impact on how much we have to grow or use in a year. So it's just some little thoughts. And my big thought is, you know, if you don't have connection to the land, then who are you? As a people, as a society, as a culture. Hope.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, my phone rang. It never rings, so thank you. That's, yeah, I really am getting that. So what I'm hearing is, you know, having a greater connection, growing our own vegetables, being more aware of, yeah, that connection to the land. So thank you. Just before I started the interview, I'd been in the garden. It was raining, and just clearing the willow and putting it into like a hedging, and lots of snails and bugs and things like that. So yes,
Yeah, and those that live kind of more to the countryside or to the areas that have it, that's great. But what I really encourage, if you live in urban areas, is still look at, you know, how can you create biodiversity in there? So one of the other things we do is we do urban wild growing. So, all those, those green patches that the city likes to plant pretty grass on, that could be producing food. That could be planted with wild, plants or local indigenous plants that start to encourage and support the local wildlife. Look at where we over densify, even in our agriculture, and what can we do there to create more, offset for wildlife forests. I know some areas, like I said, in Europe and UK are leading in that. In other areas, there's lots of work to be done. But don't think that just because you live in an apartment building that you can't do something. Look around and find an interesting way to create it, even if it's just a few planter boxes, or even if it's just looking at that front row of grass between you and the other highway divide. Because even if you're not eating it or consuming it, other critters will be happy for it.
Of course, yes. Yeah. Sometimes we forget that. I think when we grow, we think it's all about us, but actually it's the biodiversity, it's the bees, it's the butterflies, it's the slugs and the other things which come when we're fast asleep. So,
yep.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting as you're speaking. In my local town called Todmorden, they started up a project called the Incredible Edible Project, and have you heard of it? It started planting up, the local police station, the fire station, all of these different places putting these planters, and it's gradually grown. And I don't know if it's still got the same enthusiasm, but people. You can go to, say, the doctor's surgery, and they've got fruit trees there now, and it's just really lovely. So yeah, thank you. That's really inspiring. Because I lived in London for a while. I just never went into the garden. I had a garden. I just didn't have that connection. So thank you for that. So another question I had was to do with, I heard it from a teacher about 5-10 years ago, saying the importance of looking back and learning from our ancestors in order to move forward. And maybe you've already spoken about that, but what do you feel the ancestors are kind of saying to us at this moment? And what are some of the key teachings for us to start moving forward?
Yeah, there's so many ways I could answer that. Again, it's another one. I could do a whole podcast on this. But when I look at it and I think back to, we were all tribal people. We're all social cultural beings. And so, I think back to, especially when I'm in the UK, my grandfather was a serviceman. He came from Northern Scotland. He was part of the regiment. And I go, what were they fighting for, or what did they believe they were sacrificing their lives for in the Great War? And what did we learn during that time? How did we as a nation state respond? Around victory gardens, around our neighborhoods, around the fact that we are connected. And I look to today and I go, what has COVID taught us? Even in our isolation, at what point did we finally realize, hey, I'm wondering what's going on next door or over the street. Here, I was so deeply impacted by it, and I'm so aware of the destruction of our workplace. And I'm not saying that was the answer, but even when we had labor unions that were strong, that protected, the weekend, versus the box stores over in this part of the world that tore that apart. So now we have a 7-day work week, all over the place from midnight. Most of these places don't close. And so I noticed here, even in my own cul-de-sac, in my wife's territory, families that I've watched them, storming out to work 3 or 4 times a day in different directions, because that's what they have to do to get their pay. Then never had time to have, yard time, never had time to be with their kids, never had time, to just slow down and actually sit on the lawn and connect with the earth, because they were so disassembled from the frenetic work jobs they had. And it's not by accident. It's not by accident that Walmart only employs over here for 20 hours a week or less, and then offers them shifts at the last minute, because they want them to buy at the company store. And I remember my great grandfather talking about that, how the company store was robbing them first because it was owned by the business. So you worked for the man, and then you gave him everything you could just to get food to continue to work for the man. So I look at a lot of those, even just simple things, and I think, what would our elders want for us? A good life. What does a good life look like? How could we make enough to subsist in a good way, and still have time for that? And it is doable. It is doable to have both, enough of an economy to get by. And at what point are we chasing after, the next shinier thing, the next big, whatever? And where is that all coming from? So what are we educating our youth about as far as our values? What are we doing to create intentional community if we don't have one? What are we doing to, create intentional connections to the land? What are we doing to make, and strengthen our spiritual, mental, and emotional values? And so I look to the ancestors, and like I said, our report card is not good. When we look around at what is and isn't working, most of the places I walk, they're realizing that most of what we're trapped in has not been working, and we've inherited it. I have no idea the answer how we're going to solve it, but if we keep doing the same thing, I think there was a definition of insanity.
Yeah.
Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result.
Yeah. I think that's attributed to Einstein, but I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. So I look at those brilliant minds, and I look at some of the great philosophies and teachers of the world, and I can't help but think that it really is about, are we as a collective and individually, are we really happy with how our lives and our world is shaped? And if not, what are we doing to change that? There's certain things I don't have control of. And part of the challenge, as I said, living in a fourth world reality is, poverty and employment and whatever are going to be constant things, but I don't let that define me. Don't let that define our community. Don't let that define the quality of life we can live with each other. And so when I think of what does it look like, to become back to being, a tribal village, what does it look like to come back to that? And I go back to, how are you spending your time? What are you reading? What are you connecting with? Like, we really took an inventory every day. And of course, COVID forced many of that to do that, because their lives and the routines got very radically changed. So as we come back out of this, what are you intentionally doing to keep the things that you've learned worked well for you, or that you missed, or that you realized might have been absent in your life? Maybe you found someone, maybe you don't. Then work to filling those things in a good way. And then look next door to you and say, who might be struggling with some of that? Who can I share some of what I'm doing well with? Because the reality is, we are interrelated. So how my neighbor is doing should matter, because that neighbor, that person down the street, might be the person my daughter marries, if not, or my son, or, there's a lot of these stories, of amazing moments of human grace and support of one another. Well, those are your neighbors. So, then look outside your fence and see how they're doing. How can you lift them up? I know this all the time. All my kids work in a lot of the low-end industry. Even as a customer, are you being a ray of sunshine when you pick up that cup of coffee? Okay, yeah. Can you see that person in there may be struggling to make their dream come true? But do you at least, make eye contact and say, hey, Peter, it's good to see you today, or, glad that you're working, is your family good? Beautiful. And I was shocked when I came back to Northern Scotland, having been away, because in the northern communities, that was still pretty regular. When you live in smaller towns and communities, you start to see that. And most of you that live there and go to the urban, that disappears very quickly. Well, the reality is most of our globe now lives urban. Yeah. So how do we start to transform that urban landscape into, a conscious human landscape? Hope.
Thank you. It's interesting, as you're speaking about the urban, most people living urbanly, I'm hearing from my wife and others that a lot of people post-COVID and lockdown And like, I want a garden. I don't want to live in a city anymore. So maybe we will see a shift, especially with home working as well. People now being able to work from home, that we will be moving back to Mother Nature, out to the countrysides more.
Well, and I think that there's a great piece of that, and there's a cold reality, which is in the populations we sustain on the planet right now, that's still a privilege. It will now be a privilege to be able to live off the land or to live in the countryside. So I go, for those that can, that's awesome, and I hope that you help bridge other people to those connections. And I think for most, as much as it's a beautiful idea, we need to change the urban landscape. We need to change how we interconnect, and we have to change how we socialize, in that setting, and be aware of what it is that shuts us down living in, what used to be a dysfunctional urban culture, right? How is it that, when I dehumanize myself, or wherever it is that I go, when I go to, and I use this loosely, but, I go to the factory, because that's the model we inherited is we made great factory workers through school and education, that we're used to punching boxes out from 9 to 5. So how do we transform that from our schools all the way to our work and our industries, so that I am living intentionally, in a good life? And there are some, like we see some of these in places where people have opted, because they choose to be in that setting, to do that. But now, as a conscious group, how do we socially recreate that? And I think it still goes back to those one-for-one transactions. Who are you spending time with in your day? How are you greeting the world when you walk outside your space? How do we start to create more cooperative living, instead of, living, in side-by-side houses? How do we share the resources so that everybody doesn't need to have a lawnmower and a shovel and the shiny, box thing? And look at, how do we create, communities and families of intention, neighborhoods of intention, apartment houses of intention. And we're seeing a little bit of it, but what I know is that so many are hungry for deep connection with each other. So many are hungry for a more spiritual and fulfilling life. And nobody else is going to do it for you. So you need to be that change. You need to be that catalyst that starts to create it, even if it's just, twice a week, everybody comes to our house and we share food, or we sit with each other. And whatever works for you, be that catalyst.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That's beautiful. Yeah. I think sometimes we expect someone else to initiate something. We say, oh, when someone else does it, it's like, I see that especially for men. It's like, yeah, I'm hearing initiate things. Do it. So, thank you. So one of the things that we connected with, because we met through the Mankind Project a number of years ago, and we were talking about teenage boys in particular and rites of passage. For the last, little bit, I'd love you to speak a little bit about that, about what you're seeing, and maybe, yeah, about rites of passage, how we initiate the boys.
So, the simple answer is we don't. We have been conditioned pretty much around the planet about what do you call that, daycare, pre-primary. Most have been encouraged to check your children in at the local daycare, the nanny, sitter, or what have you, and the institution will start to raise them, and then we check them into kindergarten and elementary school, and we check that luggage out at about 4 o'clock and spend an hour or two. And I'm not saying this, I know that everybody wants to be loving parents, but the reality is we have trusted a system to initiate our children for the most part. And I know there's some that are out there, involved in some various youth programs and activities, and, and again, it's not that it's unintended, but I go, most people that I talk to have often surrendered their own local culture practices to I don't even know what to call it anymore. You know, it used to be sort of, we used to call it from a native world, Western culture. But we realize that most of Western cultures are aligned, to the now, what are now secular holidays, and, have lost a lot of the meaning, other than that it's a day off work, or, it's a day of extra pay in some places. But for most, the typicals, they celebrate birthdays and, certain statutory holidays. Some might recognize early puberty, but, most of the big celebrations when they graduate or get old enough to be a car, maybe. But the reality is very little of our Western world celebrates, honor, or acknowledges their children through their various stages of life. And that's true all the way into manhood. That's true into elderhood. That's true of what we've inherited systemically. Now, in Indigenous cultures, most of us have some preservation, but again, even that has been lost because of colonization. But what does it look like to initiate the children? Well, let's think about, the celebration that we have when a child is first announced in the world. We have that down pretty good. Usually, lots of people rally around, the child bearer, and there's those things. And then very quickly afterward, it gets pretty much forgotten. So, do we have aunties and uncles that get named? Are there members in the community that take responsibility for the well-being of that child that are outside of the parental units? Even the notion of the parental units, in our culture, it is the grandparents. It's the uncles and aunties that raise the child. It's the parents' job to help provide. But we've lost that in industrial culture, right? And the parents are struggling to do both. What does that say for the child? Or we expect, often underpaid educators to take on a lot of that burden in extracurricular activities. So when I think about the initiation, people sort of think like there's these sort of peak moments, but really the initiatory part of being part of the tribe, being part of the intentional community, is ongoing throughout one's lifetime. In various stages, early on, you can look at psychology and the stages of change and development of the child and notice those differences. What about when they come into puberty? Who's helping them navigate those? Well, the answer is, as we know, is quite clearly, is eventually, they start doing it themselves, whether they form into gangs or they fall into, groups or organizations, some of whom may or may not have good intention for them. And then usually about 14, when the economy kicks in, they rush headlong into the industry and into the industrial factory, because that's what they see will give them the strength and power that they want. And that's the almighty dollar often. And again, it's not that there's anything wrong with it, but who's teaching them temperance? Who's teaching them about, hey, it's great while you got all this young energy, but what might be the impact later in life when you no longer have the time to pursue the things we give you time to do now? So I'm very fortunate here on this side that we have several really great organizations that we do some very intentional gatherings every year. So like we have the Young Man Adventure Weekend. We have an organization in the Americas called the Kingmakers. And so we're men and women who, in our own programs and organizations, initiate or do things for youth. And we meet once a month in council on Zoom. And we just share what we're doing and what we're struggling with and so on. So there's a lot of great initiatives out there, but really, if you look at how do we build better human beings, it starts, well before they come into the world, and has to be supported all the way through to the very end of life. And in reality, we trust institutions to do that. At a certain point, we check them into, the senior citizens home or the old age place, the aftercare, and we don't honor those workers that do those things. They're often paid the least amount of wage. For the most precious things we have in life, our elders and our youth, our knowledge and our culture. So he said, how do we preserve that? Look at how do we take care of our elders? If we look at the life that, what kind of culture am I creating as a man, as a warrior? How are your youth and how are your women doing? Are they thriving? If they thrive, your village, your culture thrives. How are your elders doing? If your elders are well, then you have cultural knowledge. You have institutions of people who have time that have developed those skills of character to help raise that generation. So here we're very fortunate we marry those things together in a good way. And, we have started to curb the battles of suicide, teen violence, depression, anxiety, all those things that get inherited into life that leave them feeling separate. Are there for their opportunities, and we offer them opportunities. So I do tribal canoe journeys every year. So that's a way for them not only to connect, with their culture, but it also allows them to redefine who they are, because mom ain't there to make their beds or make their food or do that stuff for them. They have to find their own internal strength to cross literally hundreds of miles of ocean. We often travel 20, 30 days on the water.
Wow.
And we get hosted village to village, but they get to leave the village and find the village. Mm-hmm. So I really encourage you, if there's one place you want to have impact, look to your youth. Yeah. They're the ones that are going to be taking care of you when you get to my age. Yeah. It's Father's Day this week, and my report card is always easy. How many of the kids call me and check in with me? So I'm wishing you all out there, if you're fathers or whether you're uncles or if you're men that live in intention within the community, a blessing. And if it is empty and quiet for you, I encourage you, maybe make some connection, be a big uncle, be a big brother. Look to those groups that are doing that work. MKP does it for men. We have Boys to Men. We've got Crucible. There's all sorts of great programs out there. I was a big fan even of Mr. Baden Powell. Boy Scouting programs do some amazing work. Yes. Boys and Girls Clubs do amazing work. Rainbow groups do amazing work. Get connected.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm kind of hearing from if you're a parent and you have a child, is to search out these mentors, search out these people, because I've heard the phrase before that it takes a village to raise a child, whereas we've got this belief that it's just me, I have to do it all.
Well, I don't know if it's even a belief. It's an inherited part of the industrial society, and it's a systemic system. And I get, and again, I hold no fault to parents. It's just, even as collective parents, how do we start to undo that system of dependency, right? That says, hey, we have to put them in here, and I get some of it is economic reality. I need to work, therefore I have to use daycare, or the school provides convenient daycare. So then who is giving them their instructions of life when they come out from that place? Yeah. Who are their uncles? Who are their guardians? Who are their godparents? Who are the people intentionally being built into their lives and are going to be present throughout their lives to help them navigate that? I was very blessed that I had great grandparents and grandparents that held those knowledges and had those opportunities to spend time. But it's even right down to where are they spending their downtime. Now over here in North America, we have this huge phenomenon that we trust the TV and the internet to do that when they're not at school. And it's not intentional, it's just become an unconscious vice. Maybe not producing the best individuals that way.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. And it's we spoke about this before when we met about scouts, because I work as a scout leader. And yet I notice that we get very few volunteers who will come in and support. So kind of an invitation to men is, stepping up in whatever way they're drawn to doing. But for me, I don't know if you'd like to speak on that a little bit, of just how important that is for us as men in a role of service as we step into that kingship, into that
well, and that's what I said, that it's very challenging to show up in your life if your basket is empty.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge, is that so many get depleted in their day to day. And so what I can only say is that it may seem like it's another task to do on your to-do list. But what can be more fulfilling than spending some of your quality time that way? Yeah. Whatever that is that your calling is that's out there. So if you think that one day, someday you'll get to do this thing, I can tell you it won't happen. Retirement. So there's some crazy notions about this idea of retirement, or this idea, the weekend is my time. And the reality is, in community, the idea of personal time disappears. It's one of the hardest things, even for our non-tribal members when they come on the canoe journeys, is to realize that this notion of how we divided up personal time or free time, or I watch you wearing the earbuds. I got my headset on, but I watched the era when Walkmans came out and the
Yeah,
dissolving of conversations on buses and subway stations,
of course.
right? But that notion of somehow the self needing this isolated time, and I'm a horrible introvert, so I get introversion time.
Me too.
But to look at it and go, what may seem like another task in showing up, maybe what saves you, maybe opens that pathway to the deeper part of who you are in life. And that is in giveaway. And I know that particularly young men have the desire for it, but don't have the means, and older men lose the passion.
Yeah.
So I ask you, if you're an older man, find some passion and spend some time. Don't wait for retirement. Don't wait for, someday tomorrow to get it, engaged with something out there. And, even if it's only a couple hours, to that child or to that community, to that garden, to that whatever you put into, that's a lifetime.
Thank you.
Some of the most powerful people I met, I only saw for 5 minutes, but that they showed up, and what they said may have changed the course of my river.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, kind of as you're speaking, it reminds me, Friday nights, I'm usually meeting with scouts, and sometimes 6 o'clock, I'm tired. It's been a long week, and I'm like, oh, can't be bothered. But I go and I feel so energized by it. And that's maybe an invitation to men, is that it feels like you've got nothing left, but actually in the role of service, like you say, those 5 minutes, and I often find 10 years later, I might meet someone on the street and they know my name. I'm like, oh, how do you know my name? Because I can't remember yours. And it's because of this service on a Friday night. So, thank you. So we're coming to the end of the hour here. I'd like you, is there like projects or ways to reach out to you, or things that they could support you with, Ipswa?
Yeah, certainly. So I'll make sure, I won't be able to do it now because I'm actually having to get ready to go to our tribal meeting here. It's just about sunrise. But I'll make sure I get the info by email. But, certainly reach out to me. We certainly are always looking for support. We live in despotism of poverty here. So even a couple of dollars goes a long way. And, always looking for new medicines and new things. And so I'm always amazed when little bundles show up in the mail or the post. But our biggest thing, like I said, is, we try to do a lot of youth initiations, and that's getting out in the canoes, getting out for our sun dances, getting out for activities. And so we struggle with economy, so we're always grateful for that. And two, I love traveling. So if you have an ability to host, or you got something you think might be of interest, I do pop around quite a bit, even despite COVID. I'm the most traveling coyote grandfather The only advantage now is the airports are empty and the lineups for the cabs are rather short, and buses tend to be easily caught. So I'm enjoying the quiet out there. But in all seriousness, I love hearing about programs and stuff. So if you're out there and you are innovating stuff, get out there, Facebook, post the stuff out there and share the knowledge that you have. Because what I know is, even in those years of listening, you already have the collective knowledge through your ancestors, through your lineage. Our story is a story of survivance. The stories of apocalypses and the stories of who we are all contained in the youth and our elders. And that we're here listening and talking today is a victory dance. That we have an opportunity to do things different and to share these things is a victory. So if you're feeling down or out, just be that ray of sunshine for somebody else. You might be having the worst of days, but you can lift somebody else up in your day and maybe make it just a little bit easier on them. So be that ray of sunshine. My info will be posted, I'm sure, when this video goes out. And wherever you are, I'm wishing you a blessed day, and, to creativity and connection to one another, do as much of it as you can. Those senseless acts of beauty and those random acts of kindness, you'd be surprised just how much it changes the world and how we work with each other. So I love you all, and be well.
Thank you, Ipswa. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you. Thank you. So I'll press stop on the recording, and then we can just do a little checkout for 30 seconds. So thank you, everybody. Please do comment below, or look down in the description box below to connect to Ipswa and support him and his projects. So thank you all. I'll see you next week.